Good evening. I see a few out there. Sorry for the late start here. Had a little technical difficulties on my end, so we're a couple minutes late going live. Apologize for that. Hi, Amy, and hi, Melissa. Glad you guys are with us tonight. Who else do we got out there? As you are logging on, we're going to be continuing our walk through the Gospel of Mark. Tonight we'll be in chapter 5 through 8. Kathy and Pam are here. Good evening to both of you and welcome. Again, sorry for the late start here. YouTube kind of booted me out of the first one. So good evening. Good evening, Mike. Welcome. Glad you're with us. Tom, welcome. Glad you're here. Starting to get close to our normal amount here. We'll give it another minute or two just because I was a little late getting on here tonight. Just to make sure folks can find us before we start. Hi to Joel and Jane and Jean and Joan and Glenn. Welcome to everybody. Glad you're here. We will be picking it up in Mark chapter 5. The last time we saw how Mark really just jumped right into it. He skipped over the whole childhood of Jesus, and we just started right with the ministry. And Mark, he likes to move, and he's quick and he's succinct, and he covers a lot of ground. So I think our chapters tonight, it might be a bit ambitious to cover as much as we have tonight. We'll see how that goes. See where the discussion leads. Good evening, Lavon. And Joe and Marlene and Marge, good evening. Glad everybody's here. I think we probably can get started. I'm sure we'll have some more folks trickling in here as we go. So, as we always do, let's begin with a prayer. Dear Lord, Heavenly Father, again, we seek your blessing on our class here tonight. Send the Holy Spirit to increase our faith, to bind us together in that faith, and to help us understand more about what you tell us in your holy word. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Good evening to Joyce and Tom. That is a neat fact there. Tom says there were 12 miracles mentioned here. I didn't count, but that's a lot for a few chapters. And again, Mark, he packs it in. He focuses on the action of Jesus, a little less on the words of Jesus. Matthew and Luke hit more probably on the message. Mark is much more about the activity, the work of Jesus. All right, let's just jump right in here. We're going to be picking it up at chapter 5. And right away in verse 1, it says they went across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes. So that would be off to the east of the Jordan River, just southeast of the Sea of Galilee. If you have a study Bible, you may have a map there. But just to kind of know where we are, we're a little bit, you would say, out in the boonies a little bit, away from the big cities, and not Israel proper, I guess we would say. So he heads out there, and right away, just as we heard in church on Sunday, a lot of demonic activity in the ministry of Jesus, and Jesus runs into some servants of Satan. And the first question here says, how did Mark show the power of Satan? And then the follow-up would be, how did he show the power of Jesus? Let's just focus on the first part of that question. How does Mark show the power of Satan here in the early goings of this chapter? And hi, Joanne. Yeah, I got a late start here. YouTube was a little finicky to get going, so we got it started a little bit late, but glad you're here, and we're just getting in chapter 5. So what do you learn here about the power of Satan as you look at this first section of Mark 5? And while you're on that, then maybe we can just compare, how does that stack up to the power of Jesus in this chapter? What do you got? All right, so Melissa and Amy, chains couldn't hold him, right? He had great strength. He's breaking chains. Amy uses the word impressive there. And I think that's important for us just to remind ourselves that our world has a way of kind of making Satan this intriguing story to tell, or this guy to kind of joke about. Let's not downplay the power that he has. Jane says nobody could subdue him. They controlled this man completely, just like we saw in the sermon on Sunday. So we for sure don't want to take that power for granted. And the name he gives too, that ought to, I don't know if it made your skin crawl, but his name was Legion. Overwhelming power for sinful people to deal with. On the flip side, though, how does Mark demonstrate the power of Jesus here, and what comfort or confidence does that give you as you compare those two things? So let's just talk about that. What do you see here from the power of Jesus, and what does that do for you? Good evening to the Myers and to Jane and Mary and Pastor Kirshner. Good evening to all of you. Glad you're with us again. So Tom says here, Satan crumbles at Jesus' word. One word, right? A mere word from Jesus, and the legion falls down and begs. That is awesome power. And I think it's interesting too, and I haven't necessarily just studied specifically this topic, but if you go through the Gospels and you watch Jesus' interaction with the demons, he only ever has to speak a word. Like it doesn't appear that he's expending all that much power. Like he's simply speaking, and they can't do anything about it. So Pam, yeah, it's authority, right? He's in charge. They are not. So then the question would be, not on your sheet here, but just how does this give you comfort or courage in your life of faith? Melissa, yeah, this is probably more of a Gentile area. I mean, there's a mixed area, certainly more of a Gentile area than Israel proper. A good question. And you're right, Tom, a lot of demon possession here. And we made that point briefly in the sermon that demonic activity during the ministry of Jesus is at an all-time high because they're throwing everything they can at him to disrupt his work. So they've kicked it into high gear. They realize what's on the line. And that's interesting too, isn't it? Joe and Marlene, he was totally calm, and he doesn't seem worried at all, does he? Just complete calm, cool. He's in control. Man, that gives me all the confidence in the world to see that's my Savior. That's the guy that's in control of all things. If he can handle this, no problem. He can probably handle what's going on in my life, right? And not probably, right? He absolutely can. So good to see here. And absolutely, Melissa, and that maybe moves us ahead. She's asking here about the Israelites tending pigs. Yeah, they were unclean. They were forbidden. Anybody in the covenant was forbidden to own or to eat them. So a couple of questions. Are these Gentiles? Are these Jews that aren't really practicing their religion? We aren't necessarily told that. I am sure speculation by scholars might suggest that they're Gentiles. I don't know that I'm able to say that definitively either direction. But so that does move us to number 2 here. What's the tragic reaction the people had to the miracle that Jesus performed? So they heal this guy, and if you look at so he drives out the demons, and then in verse 15 they come out and they see this guy, and he's dressed and he's in his right mind. And how do they react? And maybe if you could tell me, why do you think they react the way that they do? And Jane, I think you're absolutely right. Certainly demons are at work today as well. I would say that the frequency of possession sure seems to be a lot less than because we see it almost constantly right around Jesus. So they're afraid. Tom and Melissa both talk about how they're afraid. Why? What do you make of that? Because he's been doing miracles now for 4 chapters, and people are impressed and amazed, and they want more. What's the difference here? Why are they scared? And does anybody see any different emotion here other than fear? Because if you look at verse 17, they plead with him to leave. They plead with Jesus. Imagine that. They plead with Jesus to leave their area. He may never be back. And I don't think we see any indication that he does come back. What's behind that? So Melissa says that they were afraid of the demon, and this guy's in control of the demon, so maybe that just ratchets the fear up a level. Ron and Joan are on that same page there too. Tom, that's an interesting question. Is there guilt here? Are their consciences actively reacting to this? I would say for sure, this isn't faith, right? This is not a reaction of faith. And maybe there's some guilt behind that. And Pastor and Peggy hit on another point here too. Is this motivated by money? They had just lost quite a bit of value, and perhaps they're upset about that too. So there's probably a couple of things going on here. I think at least though we can say that this isn't faith. They reacted, unfortunately, and they maybe didn't have another chance after this. And I think, Joel, I think that's a good summary here. Certainly, if I were to preach on this, I would make that point. Are we too at times more focused on possessions than on spiritual things? All right. Anything else there? Verse 20. The man went away and went to the Decapolis. The Decapolis is a region to the east of the Jordan River, just east of where they are now. And it's a bunch of free cities over there, more of a Gentile area again. So he heads that way. And of course, he's telling people about Jesus as he goes. All right, so we move on then. The next part of the chapter here. I'll just check these comments here. I think so. I think the demons, so to Pastor's point, I think those demons are afraid of what Jesus can do to them. Think of the one from Mark that we just heard on Sunday. They definitely know that he's got power over them, and they're afraid of him. They know they view him as the enemy, but they know they can't do anything. And Joanne, that's a good point too. This man, so look at what Jesus tells the man in verse 19 to Joanne's point. Go home to your family and tell them what the Lord has done for you. That's how the kingdom spreads. Yes, pastor goes to make calls on people, but finally when Christians tell their friends and family and neighbors and coworkers about Jesus, that's how God's kingdom grows. So, I say this a lot, but finally, the more of us can do that, right? The more God's kingdom here in Menominee Falls is going to be blessed and grow. And I'll be happy to meet all of them and to encourage you to keep sharing that gospel. So Jane asks the question, Jesus sometimes told people to tell others and other times not. What were the reasons for each? Good question. Hard to maybe make a blanket statement, but in general, when he says not to, it's because either he's looking to avoid the wrong kind of attention or he doesn't want the attention at the time of the event. Sometimes if things are a little heated with the Pharisees, he wants to cool it down because his time hasn't come yet. Sometimes he just doesn't want the wrong kind of attention. He doesn't want to be the miracle worker. He wants to be the guy preaching the gospel. And so it kind of depends on the scenario, but those would be the two biggest reasons. He wants people there for the right reason, and he didn't want too much attention from the wrong people too soon, before the time was right. All right. Melissa asks, was it a sin when those people told after he told them not to? I would say, again, it's hard to make blanket statements. In general, I'm going to have to say no. And in this case, too, Jesus doesn't tell him not to. He says, no, you can't come with me, but I want you to go home, right? So he gives the guy the green light, and he says, no, you go home and be a missionary. I got my 12 disciples. I'm good. You go be a missionary in your home and in your town. So very often he does that. But he knows, finally, a believer is gonna share the gospel, right? I can't imagine any time we would call that sinful. So I don't know. I would say no. All right, we go on to a dead girl and a sick woman. And it says here, how did the Lord put Jairus to an especially great test? So you can sympathize with this guy, right? Anybody who has raised or is raising kids, grandkids, you can sympathize the pain he's going through. And some of you out there have probably seen your children suffer in a lot of ways, and that is not a spot a parent wants to be in. So you can perhaps relate to him, but what is the especially tough test here that the Lord gives to Jairus? Tom quotes verse 36, which a verse that I love. That's Jesus daring you to believe. And what an awesome verse that is. And I think Melissa's on it here. Because initially he comes and asks Jesus to heal, right? And guess what? For these chapters, that's what he's been seeing. He knows Jesus can heal people. But what you guys are pointing out, this is different, right? Healing is one thing. Raising from the dead, that's something different. We haven't seen that yet, right? Can he do that? So you guys are hitting on that Jesus didn't make it in time before he died on purpose. So he's definitely given Jairus here an opportunity. And to your question, Pam, absolutely, he's trying to strengthen his faith. He's giving Jairus an opportunity to grow by leaps and bounds here. And notice you're all pointing this out too, the timing of verse 36. Right after he hears the terrible, terrible news that his daughter is dead. That's shattering news. And Jesus, bold, right? The first thing out of his mouth, don't be afraid. Just believe. The invitation in that phrase, just believe. I would love to see the guy's expression on his face. If you put yourself in his shoes, how do you react to that? And this is a completely different reaction than what we just saw from the crowd, right, in the Gerasenes. All right, couple comments coming in here. So Joyce says, interruption of another example of faith as critical. And I think things don't always go the way that we want or expect. It doesn't mean that Jesus hasn't heard us or won't help us. It just means he's got a little something different in mind here. Melissa asks, what's the timeline between her and Lazarus? This comes first. I'm fairly confident this comes first. I don't have that laid out in front of me, but I could be proved wrong, I suppose, if somebody out there has the timeline, but this would come first in my mind. But I'd be happy to be wrong if somebody can point it out to me. Let's see here. Yeah, so Peggy, that's a good point too. Don't bother the teacher. Well, there's not a lot of faith in that statement. And Jesus, Jesus just ignores it all, right? He's one-on-one with the guy. He cuts through everything else. Just ignore it. Eyes on me, Jesus says. Just believe. And in your life, he wants to do that too. He wants to cut through all the fog of everything else. And he says, eyes on me. Just believe. Don't be afraid. Whatever you're going through, I got this. And pretty awesome to see here. Yeah, Jane, you're right. Hard to believe for sure. So why would the woman have found it very difficult? Sorry. So question 4, on the way to heal the daughter, this woman approaches Jesus. What would have made it difficult for her to approach Jesus for help or for healing? And by the way, if you're the dad, this has got to drive you nuts, right? You need Jesus at your house now, and he keeps getting interrupted along the way, as Joyce pointed out. It's patience, right? God teaches us patience. So anyway, number 4, why would the woman have found it very difficult to approach Jesus for healing? Any thoughts? So certainly there's humble faith here, and Melissa points out rightly, ceremonially unclean. Pam points out the emotional side of this, the embarrassing, right? She's probably been trying to duck attention for years, doesn't want to be noticed. Big crowds, right? It's going to make her nervous. But her faith too is just as strong as Jairus, right? She knows Jesus can help. In fact, she doesn't even want to ask him. She's just going to sneak up and touch his robe. That's faith too, right? Faith in Jesus. Absolutely. Amy and the Myers, good stuff as well. Big crowd, a lot of people, and culturally speaking, that wasn't done. All kinds of reasons not to go to Jesus. You probably have all kinds of reasons not to go to Jesus on any given day. Whether you're tired, you're too busy, whatever, right? All kinds of reasons not to go to Jesus. Faith needs to overcome those. Faith needs to fight through that and go anyway. And to Ann's question, absolutely not. And that was a little unheard of. Not customary, which makes the woman at the well remarkable too, which we'll hit at some point. But all right, anything else? Chapter 5, man. Again, that's one chapter, and we got a lot to go. I don't know that we're gonna get it all in tonight. Let me know if you got anything else on 5. I think 6 could take a bit here too. So we get into chapter 6, and if you look at verse 3, that they're asking who this Jesus guy is. Isn't this Mary's son? There's no mention of Joseph, and the speculation is that perhaps he's died by now. We don't know that for sure. Scripture is silent on that, but some would guesstimate that to be the case. Then he sends out the 12. Nothing like throwing them out early, right? They've been with him for a little while, but he throws them, in a sense, right into the fire. Right? Get out here and practice, right? Just start. The best way, by the way, to become an evangelist is just to start talking to people. You just got to get out there. And he says, all right, get going. Let's start spreading the gospel here. Then we get into the John the Baptist section. And the first question says, Mark relates the account of John the Baptist's death. But as he does, he teaches us something about who people thought Jesus was. In a roundabout way, even Herod was forced to acknowledge Jesus' power. What did Herod's guilty conscience convince him had happened? And Joyce, that's a good comment too there, which that's yet another hurdle for that woman to plow through or to jump over. So I don't underestimate the faith it took for her. So pastor's asking the question, even Judas, I assume you're asking when he sends out the 12, That's what it says at this point. Um, and whether there's faith there or not, I don't know. Certainly later that is lacking, but he sends them out. Tom says 6 verse 11. Does that refer to anyone? And if any place will not welcome you or listen to you, shake the dust off your feet when you leave as a testimony against them. So that's explicit instructions to those disciples. But I think there's application there for us too. Finally, if people aren't going to listen, we kind of wash our hands and shake our heads and leave. Like, what else are you going to do? So he's saying this, you make it clear to them, that their refusal to listen should be a warning, right? And I think we need to do that too, maybe not in this kind of a way, but in conversation, we can warn people as well. So yes, a couple of questions here, or comments here. He thought that John was raised from the dead, right? So his conscience was clearly bugging him because John had been preaching the law to him. Number 2, how had John testified against Herod? How had Herod received it? And what did Herod's foolishness lead him to do? I'll let you answer number 2, and I'll catch up on the comment over here. Yeah, Joel, at first thought, you maybe wouldn't think it's an encouragement when he says, shake the dust off your feet, but finally it is. Well, we'll get the next one, right? There's more people to find, more people to reach out to. Not going to get them all. And there's plenty more. So let's get out there. Let's move on, right? Let's keep going. So just talk about briefly the relationship between John and Herod there in question 2. Any comments? Just explain to us some of that interaction that was happening there between the two of them. The backstory is described there, verse 17, 18. And then it goes on to tell you the story of what happened. Yeah, Tom, you're right. So there's some 6 commandment stuff going on, right? Herod had taken his brother's wife while his brother was still alive. And John was saying, hey, you can't be doing that. He's calling out his sin. Herod was angry. Yep, there we go. And I was just going to say that, Amy, that he's fascinating. It's interesting you chose that word. Herod's intrigued. He's angry. He knows he's in the wrong. He doesn't admit it as far as we know. But he's really curious. It's like he wants to hear more. So he keeps him around. And Melissa is saying that too. And you said, well, pride is in the way. And so John is there, and who knows how many more times the two of them got to talk, and John was able to share the law. And of course, you know how it ends, right? Herod puts himself in a lose-lose situation. He makes this uncertain promise, and he feels like he has to keep it or break his vow in front of everybody else. Has him beheaded, and that's the end of the story. And I think just a reminder for us, be careful what you promise. Don't make any uncertain or unknown promises. And he knew it. He didn't want, you're right, Tom, he didn't want to do it, but finally it was break a vow and maybe lose face among your entire, probably powerful guests. Or go ahead and do it. And he chose in his mind what was the lesser of 2 evils. All right, that's another one, Amy. You're right. Because you think differently about those things. Very, very good. Number 3, Jesus was rejected in his hometown. The disciples met opposition. John the Baptist unjustly put to death. But what do you see from Jesus? What do you see the rest of the chapter here? How does Jesus deal with opposition? What do you What do you learn from Jesus here? There's a lot going on right now in chapter 5 and 6, and a lot of it isn't particularly good. But how does Jesus deal with it, and what's the lesson there? How does he deal with it, and what's the lesson there? And good evening, Phil. Glad to see you out with us tonight. Okay, so Tom and Melissa are on the same page there. He keeps going, right? It doesn't stop him. He presses forward with the gospel. It makes me think of Paul in the New Testament. I press on toward the goal, right? We keep going. He kept doing the work. He didn't stop preaching. And notice what else he didn't do. Could Jesus have retaliated against Herod? Show up in his palace, one well-placed lightning bolt, boom, John is avenged. That's not how the kingdom of the gospel works. He doesn't do that. He continues doing the work that God had called him to do. He didn't lose sight of the mission. And I think that's important for you and I too. There's always going to be adversity when we're talking about spreading the gospel. We got so many cool opportunities lined up right here in our own church, and COVID's an adversity, right? We're kind of on hold here, but keep going, keep doing the work. And Amy too. It's really neat if you study, and it takes a lot of time, but when you study the Gospels and you just focus on how Jesus handles people, it's always tailored to the person. And it's really important to see that it's not cookie cutter, right? Ministry can't be cookie cutter. Every interaction we have with people, it's unique to them. And he thinks about that, and he doesn't lash out, as she says there too. All right, moving forward here, he gets to the feeding of the 5,000. And question 4 says, what details of the feeding make clear that this event was a miracle? There are those out there who will try to discredit every miracle. This is one in particular that maybe over the years has taken some heat. But as you look at the words, what here shows, or what details here make it very clear that this is in fact a miracle. And Joel and Joanne, I couldn't agree more. Just the love, and he wants to connect with each of us individually. So I'll take some thoughts here on number 4, details of the miracle that make it very clear that this is a miracle and not something else. All right, so Pastor points out just the discrepancy between the massive number of people and the pitiful amount of food. Okay, and the Betelovs rightly highlight there's more leftovers than what they started with. Okay, so the numbers again there from Melissa, right? Just the impossibility of it all. Then you figure out there's the remote place. It's not like they could have picked it up at the grocery store, right? They're kind of out in the middle of the nowhere. So very clearly, I mean, it's a miracle, and either you're going to believe it or not, right? It's described as a miracle, and pretty obviously so. It doesn't mean people are going to believe it, but this business of it being, they somehow figured out a different way. It's just not there, right? The words don't allow for that. So they feed. And that's a good point there that Pastor points out. If you aren't aware of that, they just counted the men. So conservatively, let's say if half of them brought their wives and 2 children, I mean, you're at 10 grand, right? Easy. So, a lot of people, an amazing miracle. And then we get to, the disciples, it's just one thing after another. And we get here, question 5 says, describe the dilemma the disciples faced as they made their way to Bethsaida. Notes especially the severity of their situation. So how would you describe the predicament that they're in? What are some of the key factors that would try to help you understand their terror? Really, it says they're terrified in verse 50. How would you describe the dilemma? And better yet, how is it described here? Good question, Anne. Somebody must have brought it along. One of the kids maybe had their lunchbox and brought some food with them. Maybe the disciples had a little bit in their bags. Somebody brought some out there. Good question. I never thought about that one before. So Tom says there's a storm. Yeah, I mean, fill out that picture, though. Like, what does that mean? Marge says the wind was against them. So that means they're rowing, right? They're straining at the oars. So this is hard work. They're getting no help from the wind. Middle of the sea. Okay, good. And they're making no progress. About verse 48, about the fourth watch of the night. Okay, they've been out there. It's night. They're tired. Not getting anywhere. Then you got the waves crashing, right? And the sea spray hitting you in the face. And then you can start to figure out, why they're so terrified. But then, okay, yeah, and that's the one I want to talk about, Pastor. Why did they jump to that? They thought they were seeing a ghost. Verse 49. What do you make of that? Why do they jump to that conclusion? And I don't know if their culture was more or less superstitious than ours. I think ours is getting more superstitious all the time. Yeah, Joel, that's a good point, right? There's no motor there. And I don't know if you guys have been out on the water when a storm comes rolling in. I was on Green Lake a couple summers ago, and you could just see the storm coming. And I mean, everybody got out of that water as quick as they could. Yeah, Phil says they're professionals, right? So they're gonna have a little more stomach for this than maybe you and I would. So if they're afraid, I think that tells you something too, the level of the storm that they're dealing with. Okay, so they saw a figure walking along. They assume it's a ghost. If you look at Melissa's comment, but notice the problem with logic. No human being could possibly do it. So it must be non-human. But logically, I don't know that a ghost is any more logical, right? I mean, the mind wants to jump in places that don't always make sense. They just, they gave in to fear, right? And they made an assumption, and we do that too, right? When we're afraid, we jump to conclusions, and then we see Jesus, and he shows his power. Number 6, he walks on the water, he calms the storm, he settles it down. Just another amazing miracle that they get to see. But if you look at verse 52, so he calms it down, he climbs into the boat. They're amazed. But what do you make of verse 52? They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. If I had asked you before this lesson tonight, true or false, the Bible made reference to the disciples with hard hearts, would you have thought that was a true statement? And Joanne, I like your comment too. Right away, right? He had that power. Yeah, you're right, Melissa. And certainly he knows they're going to see him, right? He's just providing them an opportunity. Again, how's their faith going to react to this? So if you look at verse 52, it says their hearts were hardened. what does that mean and what does it not mean? And then, does it ever happen to you? Yeah, that word immediately is always, so Amy's mentioning that too. You sure want to notice those kinds of words in connection with Jesus. Melissa says she would never have guessed that about the disciples. And we know that they have faith because Jesus talks about their faith, sometimes in ways that maybe aren't the most encouraging, but they have faith. So let me just maybe rephrase the question. When does it happen to you? I think there are areas of faith where each of us maybe at times is a little hardened. Anybody got an example of when you and I might experience that same thing? So I think Pastor has a good suggestion there. There may be still struggling through just who is this guy. That's a fair thought there, Nick. That's a fair thought. I would certainly say it's possible, right? I mean, I don't know what was in their minds, but that sure could be. So Joyce, yeah, I think they are overwhelmed. Amy says they're exhausted; they can't process. And I think there's finally, the sinful mind is hostile to God, right? The New Testament tells us it doesn't submit to His will, nor can it do so. We all have a piece of that yet, and there are times when we just don't necessarily want to believe either, and maybe we are too stubborn, too frustrated, whatever it is, and we aren't always so quick to believe. John, I like that comment there too. Doubts and troubles, we get overwhelmed, and we're maybe slow to believe it, And I think as pastor, sometimes when I've counseled with people who have suffered something terrible, in those initial moments. When you share God's promises, you can see there's I don't want to say a hesitancy, but when there's an angry heart or a grieving heart or a frustrated heart, sometimes that heart doesn't want to let those promises in there, right? And I just think at times we can all be susceptible to that. And I think a lot of you are saying similar things as well here. Yeah. So any other thoughts? Let me know. But I agree with what you guys are saying here too. We certainly aren't always. Our faith meter isn't always as high as we'd want it to be, right? And we have the same kind of failings as you guys are pointing out there. Yeah, when we're overwhelmed, all bets are off, right? All right, last one of the chapter here. Note the examples that Jesus set in verse 41 and 43 in regarding to receiving the food. So let's just kind of really quickly looking back at that one. I know they're out of order. So he gives thanks, right? And then he also says, pick up the leftovers. Any quick thoughts on what that means for us in our Christian lives, and any real quick observations or lessons or applications? We see Jesus giving thanks. We see him concerned about the leftovers and maybe not wasting. Any quick application to our lives of faith? I don't want to spend too much time there, but anybody have a thought on that one? And if not, that's okay too. I think we'll get through chapter 7 here. I don't know if we're going to get through chapter 8 or not, but we'll find out. Rachel's here. Good evening, Rachel. Yeah, we sure don't want to forget, right? God provides, and I think we just want to be careful about wasting what he provides. I'm not a perfect world, right? Produce is going to go bad. Milk's going to go bad. But to our ability, we sure want to conserve and make good use of what he provides. As Kathy just said, right? Remember the giver and take care of the gift. And don't forget the thanks, right? Don't forget the thanks, for sure. Yeah, that's a good point too, Joel. I often wonder, how these disciples looked back on so many of these events. Yeah, that'd be an interesting perspective. And I don't know if that's a conversation we will have in heaven, but I'd be curious to see how they viewed those things, a year or two later. That's a good point too there, Melissa. Jesus tends to give more than we need, right? And the excess is a blessing, and let's use it faithfully and wisely. Good stuff. Levon echoing that same point, right? More than we can ask or imagine, the New Testament says. All righty, let's see if we can knock off chapter 7. So he starts off talking about clean and unclean, and that's something the Pharisees they hammered Jesus and the disciples so often. They're sticklers for those rules that they've created. So how does Jesus answer their complaint? He says they said the disciples don't wash their hands before they ate. How does Jesus answer that? And by what authority does he make his point? Mike's got a good question here on verse 5. And Melissa, I like Nick's comment there as well. So while you guys are answering the first question of chapter 7, I'm going to just take a peek here at Mike's question. Yeah, so I think that's a good question there, Mike. I think verse 6 gives you the answer. If you look at the context, so he wants to do miracles to bolster faith, to strengthen faith, to help people make connections. But in such a climate of unbelief, he doesn't just want to throw miracles out there. One thing we'll notice closely throughout the Gospels, the miracle tends to reinforce the message. Here they're struggling with the message, and so he doesn't want to just throw out the miracles. My study Bible has this to say, it's not that Jesus didn't have the power to perform the miracle, he chose not to in such a climate of unbelief. And I think that's helpful. His goal for the miracle is to support the faith. He knows it usually isn't going to create the faith. Good question. All right, so Joyce says here, they're measuring Jesus' work by their traditions. Marge talks about man-made rules. Jesus calls them out for that, as Rachel points out there, focusing on the wrong thing. Yeah, and really, finally, he's calling them hypocrites, isn't he? Verse 6. He doesn't downplay this or tiptoe around it. He says, verse 6, you guys are hypocrites. And Isaiah talked about you, right? So he references God's word to back up his authority. He says, you guys are hypocrites. And then, as you said, right, they're substituting all these man-made traditions for the commandments of God. So good stuff there. Rachel says, Jesus also says again and again, your faith has made you well. I don't know that unbelief would refuse the miracle, right? Because the Pharisees kept asking for them, but unbelief doesn't believe the miracle. And that's important. I think a lot of people get that wrong. Miracles don't create faith. They support the faith, they validate and perhaps increase the faith. The word creates the faith. And that's why the Pharisees asked all the time, but they didn't have believing hearts. So it didn't matter what miracle Jesus performed for them. They weren't going to believe it anyway. All right, and Ron and Joan, you're right. They were sticklers, and they loved the law, and they loved to point out when people weren't following the law. So Jesus calls them out for that. And that's probably good on that section because we're gonna hit that topic again. Then we see the woman, the Syro-Phoenician woman, another Gentile from outside what would be Israel proper. And notice how early we are here and how much contact Jesus already has with Gentiles. From the get-go, he came to save all. He came to save all. So what do we learn from how this woman replies to Jesus? Mark handles this really much more briefly than the other Gospels, or than Matthew does. Jesus seems to be saying no. He seems to be shutting her down. But what can you learn from her reply to Jesus? Verse 28. Matthew lays this out in much more detail than Mark does. Again, Mark's focused on the action. What do you pick up, though, from her response that you could use in your own life of faith? So Melissa talks about her humility, and she doesn't argue with Jesus. She doesn't presume to tell Jesus or to place herself above him, right? There's humility there. Yep. I think some other things we'd want to say here. She accepts the word. I like that too, Jane. She didn't give up. She kept asking. She was persistent. Good. I think too. So yeah, Rachel, she got it, right? She knows the plan, but the big thing is she saw a place for herself. She listened carefully. She saw room there for her, and she seized the promise that she saw in Jesus. And I think so, Marlene. In a sense, yeah, she's just saying, "Hey, I know the plan. I know that it's Jews first, Gentiles second. I get that." But she's saying, "Yeah, I know there's a place for me, Jesus, and I'm going to hold you to that." And he loves it. He loves it when people hold him to his word of promise. That's well said as well, Amy. And Joel, yeah, she doesn't give up. I like that too, Joanne. She pressed him for mercy. He's happy to give it, but don't be bashful in asking for it, right? Good. Can you think of a situation where these verses 24 to 30 might be helpful? They're not necessarily the go-to section, for a lot of topics that might come up. But can you find a place or a situation where 24 to 30, this account of this woman might come in handy or might be especially helpful? And Joyce, yeah, there's been a lot written about that, about which, how much of that play on words there is part of this discussion. And yeah, there's some difference there between the terms. Any thoughts about when this might be a helpful section? I think I've got one in mind. I'll just maybe give a second here to see if anybody throws one out there. So an encouragement for prayer, for persistence and boldness. Yep. I would agree with those. Okay. Yeah, John, if he's not listening, right? And Marlene too, if somebody feels they're not worthy, let's say you're in a nursing home and there's this elderly individual who's never been a member of church, never prayed. What if they're saying, well, God won't help me, right? Because I didn't put in the time, right? I didn't do that. This might be a great spot to go with somebody like that. Somebody who feels like they're not they're not part of it. They missed out. It's too late. It might be a good time to use this section. And good thoughts here, right? Good lessons that we're taking home from this, for sure. Yep, and that's well said too, Joyce. I like that. Good encouragements there for us in our own prayers. And persistence too. So good lessons from that one for sure. Then we end with another healing That's a good point too, Phil. Right? He came for the sick, and we need to see ourselves that way. And she had no problem thinking of herself in those terms. The last one here: healing of a deaf and mute man. First of all, in that day and age, to have both of those would have been really tough. There are some things today, that can help people cope with those things. Still tough, but man, in that day, wow, that had to be hard. What do you make of Jesus' unusual gestures here? Verse 33. First of all, notice the personal attention. Takes him aside, away from the crowd, and it's just one-on-one time. And isn't that what we all want? One-on-one time with Jesus. You get that in his word. You get that in his sacrament. But what do you make of the putting his fingers in his ears, spitting, touching the man's tongue? What's he doing there? And I think Rachel's got it there. He's trying to tell the guy what he's about to do. He's letting him know, hey, I'm going to fix these things for you. So Jesus wants him to be aware of what's happening. And again, that's a good point, Joanne. One word, right? One word, and demons are driven out. One word, and this guy is healed. So easy. Jesus speaks a word. So much power in one word from Jesus. Luther's hymn, right? One little word can fell him. Just amazing. At this, the man's ears are opened, tongue was loosed. He began to speak plainly. And in verse 37, he's done everything well, right? The people are amazed again. Any questions on chapter 7? It is 7:30, so I think we'll pause. We won't jump into chapter 8. We'll pick it up there, but you should have all the worksheets for Mark anyway, so that shouldn't be a problem. We'll just keep going from here. But any other thoughts or questions on chapter 7? And Rachel, I think that comment is well placed too. He's not in this for attention, and he wants to deal with people on an individual and on a personal basis. And that's good lessons for us too. By and large, our church, God's kingdom, is going to grow one at a time as we have these one-on-one interactions. Any other questions on chapter 7? So good to see all of you again tonight. Just really, really a blessing to be able to meet with so many in this way. Yeah, you're right, Joyce. Jesus is always reacting to the situation and changing things as needed. Yep, so much good stuff here, and it's good. I think it's a good sign that we didn't get through 4 chapters. I'm taking that as a good sign. So we'll get after it next week again, chapter 8, and you've got the sheets. So we'll just kind of see how far we go. Okay, Joanna, thanks for letting me know that. I'm not exactly sure why that would be. Encourage them to subscribe to the page if they haven't done that. And then I'll try to do some digging to see what else might fix that. Good night, Rachel. Good to see you. I assume the audio was great tonight. I am noticing there's some glare on the top of the computer screen from the lights above. Some off my head too, that we can't fix. But if that's too distracting, the glare off the wall, let me know. But otherwise, everybody have a great night. God's blessings. Sounds like there's more snow coming, so be warm, stay safe, and we will see you again next time. All right, sounds like some are dropping out of the chatting. I don't know enough about that. Maybe, Nick, if you're listening, maybe you could think on that a little bit. What's the fix for people getting cut out of the chat? We'll see what we can do, Joanne. We'll try to let you know. Good night, everybody. Blessings. Have a good rest of the week.